and welcome to today's webinar, Glacial, the Inside Story of Climate Politics, featuring republicEn's own Chelsea Henderson. We are so glad you're here today. This webinar is presented by republicEn.org. We are a growing group of conservatives who care about climate change and want to take action. My name is Angela, and I'm republicEn's Engagement Director. We're going to start off today's event with some questions for Chelsea from the republicEn team. We're going to have a quiz, so I hope you all read your books. And then we are going to have a Q&A session to give all of you the chance to ask Chelsea your own burning questions. For the Q&A, we ask that you raise your Zoom hand and one of us will call on you. For those of you who are Zoom newbies, you can raise your hand by hitting the react button at the bottom of your screen. I'll also be monitoring the chat in case you want to drop a question in there. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to republicEn's Executive Director and former Congressman Bob Inglis.
Wow, thank you, Angela, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. Yes, so we're republicEn.org. We're conservatives who care about climate change, and we're particularly excited to have this webinar today with our own Chelsea Henderson. You probably know Chelsea from Week in Review. If you are a member of republicEn.org, you'll get that every Friday. Chelsea is the person, of course, who curates that weekly newsletter for us. And she's also the host of our podcast, EcoRight Speaks. So you might already be familiar with her voice and with her writing. But now she's got a lot of writing that she's done in the book Glacial, the inside story of climate politics. And so we're particularly excited about having Chelsea. This is sort of a time when she's lived some of this story, you know. That's the thing about being a Senate staffer for a number of years and having a front row seat and participating in the negotiations about climate policy. That's been Chelsea's role before she came to republicEn.org. And so, you know, I'm a recovering lawyer as well as a recovering politician. And what lawyers know is that in court, a contemporaneous writing is the most probative kind of writing you can present as evidence. And so what we have here is somebody who is there, Chelsea Henderson, at these tables, writing a history. So that's all very probative evidence. If you were looking for evidence of what went on, what has gone on so far in the climate world and policy, Chelsea's the one that can write about that. So, but I'm getting ahead of myself because I think Angela's going to now call on Chelsea, but I'll give it back to Angela.
Thanks, Bob. So we're here today talking about this book here, Glacial, that Chelsea Henderson wrote. And so we have a couple questions for her. And one of my first questions is, I would like Chelsea to share some more of her background. Bob just sort of went over it a little bit quickly, but some of us know Chelsea, some of us don't, some of us maybe know a little bit about her. But really, Chelsea, what qualifies you to write a book like this?
Hi, Angela and Bob. Thank you so much for your kind introductions, and hello to everybody who has tuned in. Angela, that's a really funny question because I pretty much have imposter syndrome all the time, right? And so I was asked this question last night at the book launch event that was held near my home. And I said, this is why for those who already have their book, the reference section is really long, because I wanted to make sure that anything that I wrote in the book, if people questioned it, I had a source from where that came from. Because, well, as Bob noted, I did have a number of years working in the US Senate and was party to many negotiations. I definitely was not there from the start of when climate climate policy started in Washington, D.C. But I moved to D.C. in 1997, right after I had received my master's degree. I got the itch, like, I've never worked on Capitol Hill, and that sounds fun. And this was way before the West Wing or there were any shows that made D.C. look cool and fun. I got my foot in the door in an office as like the lowest rung staff person. And so as Bob can attest to, congressional staffers wear a lot of hats. And so I was primarily doing administrative work, but I was given a little small portfolio of letters to write to constituents. I did not have the title of legislative correspondent, which is what that position would normally be, but I did a lot of that work. And the person who was the legislative correspondent for environmental issues was leaving. She was going home to go to grad school. And so I took over her portfolio. And so it was really an accident that I ended up then with this whole career working on environmental policy, because working in those letters, gave me enough cachet that I was able to then make the move to be an LC on the Environment and Public Works Committee. And then from there, just it was all a matter of kind of good luck and good timing, which I think a lot of getting a job on Capitol Hill can be. So my boss announced he was retiring. Some people left. The staff director promoted from within instead of hiring, casting a wide net to replace those people. And suddenly I got responsibilities and I was working on bills and so forth, but not climate change. I was very resistant to working on climate change. Through the late 90s, early 2000s, I worked on water issues primarily with the Corps of Engineers. And I left the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee in 2003 when my boss lost his reelection, and I went to the Nature Conservancy. And I was in the government relations shop there, working on transportation policy and EPA policy. And the McCain-Lieberman bill, which I think we'll talk about, the McCain-Lieberman bill was coming up for a vote. And I remember so clearly that the Nature Conservancy, major conservation organization in the US and abroad, the director of the government relations shop said, I want all of you on the team to call your contacts in the Senate, tell them that we support them voting for this bill. But because we don't have board permission to work on it, we can't do anything publicly if they do. So it's really just nice pat on the back if they vote for it. And that bill did not pass, but we made those phone calls. And that was really my first time working on climate change. And of course, I read the bill because I wanted to be able to answer any questions that the staffers asked me about it. And that was kind of when things started to click for me that it was an important thing to do. I moved my job over to the National Wildlife Federation, kind of was doing more broader work, and Hurricane Katrina hit. And that was when I really, really dove in hard on climate policy and ended up going back to the Hill to work for Senator John Warner on the Warner-Lieberman climate change bill. So that was that. Then I was, it was baptism by fire. I really had to be engaged then, and I haven't looked back. So, but it's still kind of crazy to me that in 2003, a major conservation group in the United States did not have permission to work on global warming. So we've definitely come a long way.
Thanks, Chelsea. So what inspired you? What inspired you to finally write this book?
Well, funny story. My dad is on this webinar. My dad is a nonfiction author, as Bob can say, attest to. He is a nonfiction author. Bob read Sons and Soldiers, right, Bob? I think you wanted to say a little something about that.
Yes, I got to have a shout out to your dad, Bruce. Bruce, it was a wonderful book that really I got an awful lot out of. If anybody hasn't read it, it's about Jewish boys who got out of Germany, came to America, and then went back to fight Hitler. It's really quite an inspiring story.
So my dad, nonfiction author for years, has been like, why aren't you writing a book? Why haven't you written a nonfiction book? I was toying around with some fiction. I had four unpublished fiction manuscripts. And I thought, well, I like to make up stories and I hate to do footnotes. So that's why I don't write nonfiction. Then he was in between projects, and he called me one night and was asking a lot of questions about climate change and why this bill didn't pass and what date something happened. And I was like, what, it's just easier for me to completely write this all out as a chronology. So I sat at my computer and I started where the story started for me, which are in my, not me personally, but what I knew, which was Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And put together this 6-page chronology. And then I sent it to him and was like, here you go. And, players, big champions, et cetera, et cetera. And he's like, there's your outline for your book proposal. So haven't looked back. That was in 2021, and really learned along this process how long it takes to get a book from here to here.
So why now? Why do you think that this book is so timely and important that it's coming out now during an election year, during polarization? Why is this so important?
I mean, the fact that we are so polarized on climate change, to me, makes a book like this even more important, because you can see how bipartisan we used to be. And so I didn't know until I started to do the research for this that the first president to be briefed in great detail on climate change was LBJ. In 1965, he made an address to Congress that was about the environment more broadly, but he mentioned our unfettered emission of carbon dioxide and some of the impacts that we were going to see by the year 2000 if we didn't figure out a way to curb those emissions. So a little bit of fortune telling there, right? We're seeing today definitely the stuff that was described to LBJ. And Nixon was briefed on the dire impacts of climate change if we continued to emit CO2. Nixon was sort of a unique guy in that he actually didn't believe you needed a president for foreign policy. He thought, or sorry, backwards. He thought you only needed a president for foreign policy, not for domestic issues. So he really surrounded himself with staffers who could just advise him on domestic policy. And he just, you're the expert, right? I'm going to do what you tell me to do. John Ehrlichman, before he went to prison for the crimes he committed at Watergate, was a environmental lawyer from Seattle and cared a lot about the environment. And so Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a big liberal Democrat that Nixon adored and hired to be to manage part of his domestic policy, wrote a memo to Ehrlichman saying, this is going to be a big deal. Seattle's going to be underwater. San Francisco's going to be on, New York's going to be under, all the big coastal cities. And this is something that we need to elevate to the president. And that memo was uncovered in 2010 when the Nixon Library released a set of memos. So, the early on, this was an issue that it didn't matter what political party you were part of. It was something that was happening. People cared. Al Gore gets a lot of credit for bringing the issue to Congress, but he was not the first. There were definitely other lawmakers who were, trying to chip away at the issue. And it wasn't until the 80s that we really saw action, or not action, but congressional interest. The first hearing that Al Gore had on this issue, nobody came. And, he was a junior congressman and he got his first gavel and he was, I'm going to have this hearing. I'm going to teach my colleagues about this. This is something that he had learned about in college and was really worried about. And nobody came to the hearing. And, I think about my worldview and how I do things. If like none of you came to this webinar, I'd be like, well, I guess I'm going to move on and do something else with my life. He kept at it. And, but the guy that got all the thunder, so to speak, in the Senate was another old boss of mine, Senator John Chafee, held the first hearings in the Senate, some of the first hearings in the Senate, and definitely the first hearings that made the World News Tonight and the major media outlets. And he, as a Republican subcommittee chairman, when the Congress changed, he sat his staff director down and said, let's call all the environmental groups in and hear what their priorities are going to be for the next congressional session. And so I know Bob, as a former congressman, can definitely attest to this. The idea that today you would see a Republican chairman of one of our natural resource agencies calling the environmental groups and inviting them to a 2-day meeting to hear what their priorities were, and then working on those priorities, is a little bit mind-blowing, but that was kind of how things were. And there was only one group that mentioned climate change, and Chafee had never heard anything about it. And so he's like, we're going to work on that because that's cool. Like ozone is, Reagan's moving Montreal Protocol through. We'll continue to dabble in that. And acid rain, George Mitchell from Maine has got that. So he wanted something that was his own. And he made the greenhouse effect and studying it and hearing from the scientists and trying to figure out the solution, his priority. So Angela, to get to your question, there are a lot of historical examples of times that this issue was so bipartisan. And in fact, many of our environmental issues fell more along regional lines than they did party lines. You're from the Midwest, you loved your manufacturing facilities that were pumping out some of those pollutants that were affecting the Northeast states. So you had Northeast against Midwest. It wasn't Democrat versus Republican. And that was something that we really didn't see come until the 90s. And I think we're at a point today where we can't afford this polarization. You know, we can't afford it now. We certainly can't afford it much longer. And so I do hope that people will read Glacial and they will be inspired by that past nonpartisan effort to address a problem and say, we did it once before, we can do it again.
Chelsea, you've just mentioned some interesting names from the past, Ehrlichman to Nixon. And then you mentioned Senator Chafee, and you Senator Warner, and you've talked about these are all Republicans that were reaching out to do something about climate. And so it's really quite a history that conservatives have on this, right? I mean, but something happened. What do you think happened? How did it go from, like you just said, Chafee reached out saying, listen, there's one group that wants to talk about climate. That's what we want to work on. What happened, you figure?
You know, at last night's book reading, we talked a lot about turning points in history. And I do think that one of those turning points might have been the 1992 election, when Clinton and Gore won that election, sort of coming out of nowhere, because in 1991, and I do mention this in the book, George H.W. Bush had a 90% approval rating. And the Democrats were not putting up their big dogs, right? I didn't even know who Governor Bill Clinton was, right? When he emerged I was like, who is that? I was in college, I remember. The only thing I knew was he had a daughter named Chelsea. And even Clinton was running in third place in June before the election in 1992. Something happened with that election. So I've heard people say, or I guess, project perhaps, that if H.W. Bush had won re-election, he ran in 1988 on being the greenhouse gas president, or the greenhouse effect president. He was the one that was going to solve this problem. He was really trying to distinguish himself from Reagan on the environment. He gave a 30-minute speech in Detroit on why environmental protection was important. So I think if he had won re-election, maybe there could have been something that was done. He helped obviously with the first big international meeting in Rio in 1992, but he didn't win, right? So then in 1994, when the Contract for America happened, when both Congress and the Senate flipped into Republican hands, and there was a huge push for deregulation, that's kind of when we first see that that whole thing where it's not regional anymore, it's more party-based. And even Chafee at the time almost lost the gavel of the EPW committee, because Bob Dole and Trent Lott were under a lot of pressure to bypass. Typically, you get a committee gavel because you've earned the seniority. You're the most senior member on that committee, and it's the most highest level committee that you have that seniority on. So you can't be the chairman of 2 A-level committees or 2 super A committees, which are like the most powerful. So you kind of it's a little bit of a horse trading game. But Chafee wanted to be on the Environment Committee, and when you look at the roster of who was on that committee through the 80s and early 90s, it was guys that wanted to do something good for the environment. In 1994, after that election, there was this pressure to take the gavel from Chafee. Chafee fought back. He had already lost his a role in leadership, actually, because of his position on choice issues. And so he fought back. He's like, I've been waiting a long time to get this gavel. I'm not going to lose it now. And so they decided they would not bypass the committee, the typical protocol, and they would let him have the gavel. But then they asked him to fire his staff. And he's pushed back on that and said no. And so then what they did was they stacked the committee with a bunch of people that didn't like the environment, didn't want to do things on the environment. And then you sort of saw more of a polarization where Chafee and maybe one other or two, depending on the bill, other members on the Republican side might vote for something or get behind something. But it was not, you didn't see the same, I guess, bipartisan spirit that had existed in the past. And so I sort of see that as a big turning point. I was going to read this like one short passage from the book, that leads to another prominent Republican who engaged on climate. This chapter is called McCain Dons a Cape. Many mornings leading up to the 2000 New Hampshire First in the Nation primary, where retail politics is on full display in diners and other local establishments, recent Dartmouth graduate Matthew Stembridge, a.k.a. Captain Climate, woke up, pulled on his red tights, cape, and bright yellow galoshes, his homemade superhero costume, and headed to that day's candidate rally. Sponsored by 2 environmental groups, he and other similarly dressed youths had one mission: ask the presidential candidates, regardless of party, their plan for addressing climate change. I'm Captain Climate, sent back from the future to educate our leaders so they could avert disasters, Stembridge proclaimed to reporters on the campaign trail. Arizona Senator John McCain, the Vietnam War POW with a maverick streak, hoped to upset Texas Governor George W. Bush in the Republican primary. He couldn't help but notice Captain Climate and his team in the audience at multiple events, and was struck by the passion of the young activists holding handmade signs. One day, he invited Stembridge up to the stage and asked why he was there. "I want to know your plan for addressing climate change," Stembridge said. McCain didn't have a plan, but at least he was honest about it. "I'm concerned about climate change," he told the crowd, "and I'm going to do something about it." New Hampshire loves an underdog, and McCain went on to upset Bush in the quirky New England state, only to flame out in South Carolina, sorry, Bob, amid racist attack ads that targeted his adopted daughter. Returning to his job in the Senate, McCain made good on his promise to the climate kids of New Hampshire, by scheduling a suite of hearings on climate change in the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, which he chaired. "I do not have a plan," McCain reiterated at the first hearing. "I am sorry to say that I do not have a plan because I do not, nor do the American people, have sufficient information and knowledge." Over the course of several marathon hearings featuring the world's most respected climate scientists, McCain came away convinced that he should step into a leadership role. So, I mean, I just love that as an example of a time that someone was like, hey, what is happening? I don't know. I'm going to be honest that I don't know, and then I'm going to do something about it.
Yeah, and isn't it amazing? Elections have consequences for sure. I mean, if you think about the Clinton Gore win against George H.W. Bush, maybe if they hadn't won, Al Gore wouldn't have become the owner of the issue or something, which unfortunately created a negative reaction. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? And so there's definitely a reaction to him claiming that mantle. But then, like you just pointed out, if McCain had won in that primary, maybe he would have gone on to make it a signature issue. So elections have consequences.
Yeah, in 2008, when the Lieberman-Warner bill was on the Senate floor and we lost, and we knew we were going to lose, right? We knew we didn't have the 60 votes that you need to cut off debate. In fact, I think it was McCain-Lieberman that had a deal. They only needed 50. So we needed 60 to cut off debate. And when it didn't happen, the general consensus was, okay, well, whoever's president next year is going to do it. Because we knew even if we passed a bill in the Senate and they passed a bill in the House and we got to conference, if we put a bill on Bush's desk, he was going to veto it. He'd said so in his statement of administration policy. But at that point, in June of 2008, we had McCain, and then Obama and Hillary Clinton were vying for the Democratic nomination at that point. And we're like, well, whoever wins, McCain, Obama, or Clinton, will have a climate champion in the White House and we'll get it done. Now, Obama did go on to win and we still didn't get it done, but that was definitely that mindset was like, even still if McCain won, that we would still be able to do climate change.
Yeah, you know what that illustrates is a question for you is, what was it like to write an autobiography? In other words, you were in some of this, right? You were writing you were writing about your own time. What was that like?
One of the funniest texts I have received this week was from Angela, who was like, when you're talking about Chelsea Maxwell, is that you? And so I did write about myself in the third person, very awkward and weird, but it was an important part of the story. So I felt really compared to share it there. I'm looking very young with David McIntosh, who worked for Senator Lieberman, and then Senator Lieberman and Senator Warner on the far left. And, when we introduced that bill, this was the press conference in the EPW hearing room, and Senator Warner, I almost feel like he's glowing looking at us, right? When the reporters started to ask questions, he was like, let David and Chelsea answer the questions. And so then we had to answer all the questions about the bill, probably because he hadn't read the whole thing. But yeah, that was a really
Well,
fun
uh,
moment.
Chelsea, I gotta say, you look like yourself in that picture, but David McIntosh, I hope he's not on the webinar. I know David. That's not what he looks like today. Of course, he could say the same thing about me. He'd say, Bob, what happened to that hair? Well, what didn't fall out turned white. But
I
anyway,
think
so
it might be a different. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it might be a different David McIntosh than the one you
okay,
know.
okay, good. I was wondering if that's my guy. I'm thinking, wow, okay. So yeah, and so what were some surprises you found in writing the book? I mean, this is what's really neat is I've always thought what would be neat about one's life is to, and you weren't writing about your whole life. I was joking a little bit about the autobiography. There is a role that you played there, but it's not all about Chelsea. It's all about the history of this. But I've always thought it'd be fun to have a timeline of one's life where you go back and really figure out what was going on in various quadrants of your life. And so here you were writing about this, living it, and were there things that you found out in researching it that you found surprising?
So one thing that sort of came out, or I only learned about it after, maybe because I was in the midst of it at the time, so I wasn't supposed to know. Um, while the Senate margins were different, I feel like the last few election cycles we've had such a narrow, 50-50 or 51-49 Senate that it's hard to imagine a time when, either party had 55 or 56 or 57 seats. The Democrats were in charge in 2007, 2008 when we were working on the climate change bill. And so there were 10 Democrats who called themselves colloquially the Dirty Dems. And in fact, one of the staff people that told me that this was their moniker was like, we're not sure the bosses knew that we called ourselves that. But so here you had a group of legislative assistants working for their bosses. And the LAs, the legislative assistants, all really wanted to get their bosses to yes on the Lieberman-Warner bill, but obviously had to advocate for the best position of their bosses back home as well. And so when I really found out the Dirty Dems met once a week, they were, they each took a different sector, like somebody was working on ag and somebody was working on heavy energy intensive manufacturing. And they each took the lead kind of figuring out what would be the policies that would need to be in a climate change bill for our boss to have cover to support it, cover back home with whatever the major polluting industry was. And so just understanding now that that process was ongoing and I wasn't privy to it, I wish I had known, right? Like that was really surprising to me because I think Warner would have been one to open the door and negotiate with those folks. Unfortunately, Chairman Barbara Boxer from California was scared of them and wouldn't really have conversations with them. She would have conversations at them. So one of the biggest accounts I got was that she was really good at saying, here's why you should care about climate change, and wasn't very good at sitting back and listening and hearing what her colleagues needed in order to support a bill. And so it was really enlightening, I guess, to see that that process was ongoing. But also I wanted to illustrate that it wasn't so easy, just because in today's world and under today's calculations, if you looked at a Senate that had 55 or 56 Democrats, you would think the path to 60 would be easy, but because they had that in 2007, 2008, it didn't make it easy because you had basically 10 Joe Manchins who were like, not so fast.
Yeah. Well, hey, I want to get to Angela, who has a quiz for everybody here. But I got to ask one last question, which is, if you had a chance to add one more chapter, what would it be?
Well, I would love to add the chapter on Congress enacting a price on carbon.
Yeah.
That would be something in the future, obviously, not something that we are living or experiencing, but I would love to see our country come together because the Inflation Reduction Act, while it had a lot, it was passed through in a very partisan way, but it had a lot of good individual components that a lot of Republicans supported. And a lot of that money is going to red districts across the country. But it's not enough. Like, I don't think it's enough to incentivize clean energy. I think we have to have that cap. And the best way to do that is you price carbon, this is how much you can emit, or you're going to pay more, and people will quickly figure out a way to not emit more, right? Because they don't want to pay that tax. And if they do pay the tax and you use the tax for tax abatement, or, you know, CCL, our pal CCL are very bullish on the dividend check that would go back to Americans. So I think having, you know, I would love to come back and say, oh, in a future edition, here's what Congress achieved. They passed a tax on carbon.
Yeah, so we're interested in you writing that addendum to the book. Okay, we got to get that done. But Angela, you've got a quiz.
I do, and I hope that everybody has been paying attention. So we've got 3 questions for this quiz, and let's just go ahead and jump into it. So our first question, who was the first president to be briefed on climate change? We've got
Wow.
Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. And I can see your guys' votes coming in. We're up to 62% participated. Let's keep seeing those answers. When I see it slow down, then we're gonna find out what the right answer is. And Chelsea's gonna have some wisdom to impart on us about it.
Are you ready for me to give the answer? Are we done?
Yeah. So
Only 80% have participated.
yeah, we've got 80% participants. So let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results with everybody.
LBJ.
Yeah,
The people who didn't get that came on late, maybe when I was talking about Nixon. You know, Jimmy Carter, just seeing that somebody voted for Jimmy Carter, he was an interesting, he was a little bit of a conundrum, right? Because he came into the presidency at a time when we had this terrible oil crisis, and people were very concerned about being beholden to foreign oil, which in part was why Gerald Ford, prior to Carter coming to office, he presided over the first, not only presided over signing the bill that instituted the first fuel efficiency standards, he fought the big 3 in Detroit for them. You know, they were testifying that if they were forced to have mandatory fuel economy standards, every car was going to be smaller than a Pinto and this and that. So he stood up to the big 3 and was like, we need this because, and nobody was thinking, oh, we're going to do this because of the greenhouse effect, right? They wanted to stick it to OPEC. And so they did, right? They instituted the first fuel economy standards under Ford. But then Nixon came in, and, or sorry, Carter came in, and he still bore that responsibility of, we have had this oil crisis and we never want to be in a position again where, you know, I remember being a kid, and if your license plate ended in an odd number, you got your gas on odd number days and even on even number days. So Carter was very cognizant of that and was putting money into things like exploring coal to liquids, which is like one of the most highly emitting processes that you could imagine, and other synthetic fuels that were also high emitters. But then he put solar panels on the White House, and he was a big believer in having a solar tax credit and trying to incentivize clean energy. So I guess you could say he was a balance. He also believed in putting on a sweater, so which is a very mom thing to say when my kids are like, it's cold in here. I'm like, put on a sweater. But yeah, he was not, you know, he probably wouldn't meet any environmentalist purity test today, given his position, some of his positions.
All right, folks, let's get our quiz 2 here. So who championed the first national climate change bill that was signed into law? And hint, hint, I'm sure you guys heard Chelsea say earlier, it's not Al Gore. So who do you think? And I don't want to hear about anybody cheating and looking this up online while we're quizzing everybody.
But if you read the book already and you know, I'll send you a book plate.
Bob's cheating, but at least he admits it.
Yeah, exactly. I've got the book.
All right, so we've had about 60% participated in this. Oh, it's going up a little bit. Let's go ahead and end the poll so we can get this train moving.
So actually, it was George Brown from California, somebody no one has ever heard of, which should have been your hint, right? Senator Ed Markey is kind of known today for his advocacy for the Green New Deal. Senator Pat Moynihan wrote that memo to Nixon, but then when he went into the Senate, he was definitely more of a, he was Finance Committee chairman at some point, and actually had a role to play in the BTU tax debacle that has led even today's lawmakers to be scared to touch a carbon tax. And then Claudine Schneider actually did have one of the first, she basically, so Tim Worth had a very big, comprehensive, almost kind of like a real bill form of what the Green New Deal was trying to achieve, bill in the Senate. And then Claudine Schneider had the House companion of that. And she was a Republican from Rhode Island, kind of cut in that same cloth as John Chafee. But yep, George Brown, he wins. And it was just to establish a national climate program, which we didn't have. So that was like a way to center some of the research and definitely, you know, important first steps.
All right. So quiz question 3. What superhero inspired Senator John McCain to get interested in climate change? We've got a little picture there to give you a hint. Choices, we've got Green Guardian, Climate Crusader, Captain Climate, and the Carbon Crusher.
I'm glad to see people are mostly listening to me when I talk.
Yes, this was a listening test as well as a reading test.
Share our result.
Captain Climate. There he is in his homemade costume.
Are we ready to open this up to the floor? I want to hear everybody's burning questions that you have for Chelsea. And like I mentioned earlier, if you want to ask Chelsea a question yourself, you're going to go to the react button and you're going to raise your Zoom hand and we're going to call on you. So who wants to be our first question asker there? So we've got some hands raised. We've got Stuart Birnbaum. Why don't you go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chelsea and Angela and Bob. So you're using in your title, glacial, a geological metaphor. And as a result of our changing climate and the accumulation of meltwater at the base of glaciers, they are surging. They are moving very rapidly. So in your opinion and your experience, what will it take to get a surge in Congress to enact climate policy?
Well, I hate to say that we only do things under duress, right? But the American people do have a history of coming together under times of intense crises. So, you know, after 9/11, we created the Department of Homeland Security and changed, you know, completely reimagined how airline travel works. And I hate to think that we have to wait for that kind of tipping point to happen, but it might be. Now, what gives me hope on the other end of the side of that coin is that the politics hasn't caught up with the polling, right? So poll after poll after poll shows us that 3/4 of Americans not only accept the signs of climate change, but they think the federal government should act in some capacity. And so that isn't really trickling down to all of those people who make policy decisions. Bob, as a former member of Congress, can talk a little bit more about what it takes as a lawmaker, what you need to hear from or who you need to hear from. I do think I know there's so many CCL people on this call or on this webinar. You know, you guys are so great about having meetings with your members of Congress and sending letters and writing LTEs and so forth. And I think that kind of noise helps. I think that lawmakers do need to see the major industries in their districts and states in support of something they need to hear from constituents. But Bob could definitely elaborate on that part and what helps move a lawmaker.
Yeah, we just need it to move fast because there's a question just asked us, Stuart, you're onto something. What if we have to change the meaning of that word, glacial?
Oh, God.
You know, in other words, that it
Lots of
becomes
questions.
it becomes that it's something that goes fast. You know, that's sort of wow. That's just a terrible thought, isn't it? That it's like renaming Glacier a national park. You know, Might need to rename it. What was the temperature out there? Like it was in the 90s for a week in a row or something this summer at Glacier National Park. Yeesh. Um, anyway, so yes, it does take some capture the imagination to cause people to give permission to members of Congress and senators to act. Because our theory at republicEn.org, let me not burst any bubbles here, is that politicians follow, they don't lead. So what you have to do is you have to create this constituency of support, and then they feel comfortable leading. And it is all about whether there's a sense of support out there. So in the end, it depends on us. Angela, I guess you've got a question from Susan, I think.
Comment on John Webster put a quote, a supposed Churchill quote in the chat that I actually have in the book, that Americans can always be trusted to do the right thing once all other possibilities have been exhausted. So we'll get there.
We've got Susan Steinhauser, and Susan, you were one of our book winners, weren't you?
Thank you. Yes, and I have it right here. I received it last night. So thank you so much, Chelsea, and thank you, Angela, just for being here and putting this together. And I look forward to reading Bruce's book as well, now that you mentioned it. So the question that I have is not so much about policy, but rather get out the vote efforts. I'm co-chair of our local Climate Reality Project chapter. I'm also active with our local CCL chapter. And I found it interesting that our CCL chapter was cleared to work with the Environmental Voter Project. However, Climate Reality, and this is not to throw them under the bus. I love Al Gore and the work we do, but we were not allowed to officially sponsor any postcard writing parties. Climate Reality does have a get out the vote effort. We were told quite specifically that we may not say vote climate, and that it was due to an IRS designation of the word climate as a partisan issue, to which I've offered to write a Climate Action Now action for anybody who uses the Climate Action Now app to urge that declassification. But in order to write that action, I need to understand what I'm writing about. Talk about imposter syndrome. Holy moly, I'm a scuba instructor. So anyway, trying to learn as much as I can very quickly about this classification. Does anybody, Chelsea, do you have any, Angela, any input?
This is my first time hearing that. I don't know if there's someone else on the webinar who's familiar with it, but I'm definitely going to go look it up because that does seem, well, odd and like something that would really hold back some of those get out the vote efforts.
Yeah, Susan, my guess is that it's mostly the word vote, the verb vote, more than the word, the noun climate, that is causing Climate Reality Project a little bit of angst. Because, for example, if somebody from republicEn suggested that we do some kind of a vote project, I'd be nervous because it's the one thing that gets you capital punishment as a 501c3. In fact, Cindy is shaking her head. She's a lawyer. She might be able to help us with that. Cindy, can you tell me that's the problem, right? It's capital punishment.
I don't have, I haven't read, the part of the code, but I'm guessing that Bob's right. Because the 501c3 limitation is the focus is on educating on issues rather than advocating for particular lawmakers. So that is a possibility. Possibly the word think about climate, get out and vote, think about climate, there's possibly some way to finesse that.
Oh yeah, because what Cindy's into there is real finesse. Susan, we do this all the time. We educate at republicEn.org. Now the difference between that and lobbying is probably about that much, but hey, we got to preserve this 501c3 status because we all want you to give tax exempt money to us. And so we do watch that very carefully because it is important for the IRS to not get over into campaigning, because that is capital punishment for a 501c3. You lose your status at that point. You can do a little bit of lobbying as a 501c3, but you got to be very careful not to ever get involved in a campaign. So, but Angela, you have somebody else in the queue, I think, or I
Well-
called on Cindy, and now Cindy might have been talking about something else.
Oh, I had a different, hi, Chelsea, I apologize. I've not ordered the book yet, but I'm going to. It sounds fascinating. And I'd love to see you get on the bestseller list, a feat I have not achieved in my own writing. So, I've been really interested in natural gas lately. It seems to me the middle place. I mean, nuclear power is one of the middle places too. But because the Paris Accords, the US, basically the US is on record internationally as attempting to phase out fossil fuel entirely in about 10 years, which seems quite unrealistic to me. And that policy commitment is really disfavoring natural gas in various policies. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, if you perceive that maybe moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans can come together on the issue of natural gas being far preferable to coal.
Yeah, and I think that you're seeing that just in how the energy markets play out because natural gas is cheaper than coal. But I happen to know, I have a friend that works with a company that it's a little wonky and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but they make these engines so part of the struggle with power plants, even those that use natural gas, that are trying to put more renewables into the grid. So if you're looking in a place like Texas, right, so much wind in Texas and whatever, the fossil fuel power plants are so clunky that you can't just be like, okay, we're turning off the natural gas today because it's going to be windy. It takes like 5 hours or something to turn off the fossil fuels so that you can get the renewables. So even states that have created these mandates around you have to have this much renewable energy, it's really hard, even with natural gas, unless these power plants have this special engine that my friend's company produces that have a on and off switch that is, it's like a 5-minute turnaround time period. And so you can really account for the wind is blowing, the sun is shining, or whatever that is today. But they're also looking at sort of how do you have synthetic fuels, not of the Jimmy Carter era, but like green synthetic fuels, because you're never going to 100% run a power plant on wind or solar, right? We're always going to need that kind of the bridge fuel, some call it, or you need that back because we need consistent power. Look at us. We are so beholden to power. And that's not even talking about what data centers require, how much AI is consuming. So we have to account for an increase in demand and power demand, and also that decrease in fossil fuels. And we also have to make fossil fuels viable to deal with the intermittency. And I'm just so glad I'm not a utility operator, because these sound like really complicated questions. But yeah, to your question about can Republicans and Democrats get together, I mean, that is the underlying question for all of this, right? We need to get together and really have very targeted discussions about these different pathways toward solving the climate crisis.
So we've got we have James Sawyer with his hand raised.
Thank you for your program. And I enjoyed Ms. Henderson's comments about rising demand for electrical power. I became interested in climate issues. I'm a retired MD, and I became interested in climate issues and wanted to learn more about it when I heard Mr. English speak at a meeting I attended. My major question is, the more reading and I don't see any way we're going to meet climate reduction and polluting power production without a big increase in nuclear production. And there is a very interesting series on MITx about nuclear power and the issues with fusion power generation that I've recently watched, including the discussion of the economics involved in those two. But I think as electricity costs go up and up, There was an article in Wall Street Journal yesterday about rising electricity costs for people in the San Diego area. But I think nuclear power is essential to meet those goals, and it's becoming more cost effective as power increases. So my question is, do you see that Congress is moving, or the leadership moving toward an understanding that we need to have a big increase in nuclear power?
I definitely think that that is not as polarized of an issue as it used to be.
Good.
When I was working on the Lieberman-Warner bill in 2007, 2008, Senator Warner, who had a naval background, had been the Secretary of Navy under Nixon, he was a firm believer in nuclear power because, as he put it, he chief of all of those naval
Yes.
ships that had power on them.
And that's
And
very interesting comment, because our armed forces, the Navy, has done it since the 1950s and done it safely and very effectively.
well, at the time, Senator Warner wanted to get what we could for nuclear in the bill. And we kind of had a fine line on what was in our committee's jurisdiction without crossing over, and we didn't want to cross over. So anyway, one thing that we landed on was, a lot of the nuclear engineers in the country are at retirement age or past retirement age. After one of the reactions to Third Mile Island was kind of a shuttering or a constriction of nuclear higher education for nuclear scientists, nuclear engineers. And so you don't have the knowledge base in the younger generations to continue with a vibrant nuclear program in this country. So Warner, this was a big issue for him. He wanted to have some program that would start to reinvigorate the academics around training these engineers and the sort of the future power plant workers of America, and not just at the engineering level, but the guy that turns the key, that does what, like at all kind of levels.
Yeah, all the people who do it, yes, maintenance and all.
Our bill almost fell apart the night before we went to the Senate floor because Barbara Boxer disapproved of that provision, and she wanted it out. And I remember we had this huge member level meeting. I remember she called me personally and was like, Chelsea, you have to get John on my side on this. And I was like, this is his baby, right? This is his provision. He hasn't asked for much in this bill. This is very important to him. And just that little time, it wasn't, it was not a subsidy for a nuclear power plant or anything kind of big and expensive and, something that would put her in a bad space. It was literally for training and education. And we had such a head-to-head fight about it. And she did eventually relent, but it was a big deal. And nuclear actually blew up the second version of the McCain-Lieberman bill. They went to the floor the first time in 2003. They lost. McCain, 5 years as a POW, did not give up easy. So he was like, we're just going to keep having votes on this bill until I get the votes that I want. And that was the strategy he'd employed to get campaign finance reform. In 2005, the 2005 iteration of the McCain-Lieberman bill had a nuclear title, which the previous bills had not. And they got fewer votes on that bill because Boxer, again, rallied a bunch of the progressive Democrats to vote against it. And so, in a way, it's sort of embarrassing for them, I think, for this group of Democrats that voted against a climate bill because of one component like that. But I don't think that's where we are today. I think today, the leaders on climate change and both sides, this is an issue where you can find real good unification and I think good bipartisan spirit. So I do hope that we can see continue and grow.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And thank you very much for your program. And I highly recommend that MITx program about atomic energy. It's very good.
And Chelsea, it's interesting that when you have people like Jim Hansen and Bill Gates on board with development of nuclear, it really causes, I think, some head turning on right of center, because people think, wait, Jim Hansen, he's supposed to be over there, crazy lefty. No, he's really not. He's talking about nuclear power. And then you get Bill Gates, same thing. It's really, that may help, as you see some things in the chat, it may help turn around some of the polarization. You think it might give you the opportunity to write that addendum?
Yeah, that could be a, we'll have to do another chapter where we figure out our net zero emissions plan for utilities and our carbon tax.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the other issue, I've read part of the MIT lecture, is that France generates 70% of its electricity by nuclear power. And, we haven't heard a lot of adverse events due to that.
Right.
Yeah.
And Germany scuttled theirs and then was reliant on Russian.
Right. Now they're relying on Russian gas, and their power bills are out of sight in Germany. Have really gone up. I was there this summer and heard it. The power bills are really expensive.
Yeah.
All right, folks, we are nearing the end of our hour. We have one more person with their hand up, Matt in New Hampshire. Matt, can you make this one a quick one?
I will try to. Thanks, Chelsea, for the book, and thanks for sending a copy to New Hampshire. I appreciate that. Just starting to dig into it. I'm wondering, have you got any response from conservative news outlets? Anybody reviewing your book? I tried to do a quick search. I didn't find much. Tell me what people are saying on the conservative side, because that's the people we want to talk to, right? Go ahead.
Yeah. I have not had any reviews from conservative media at this point. I have, it's early days. So this came out yesterday. You got one of the copies. I believe I sent you the copy from my stash of copies that the publisher gave me. So you got it a little early. But yeah, I think we'll continue to kind of get the word out. And I do have this dream of getting it in the hands of lawmakers in both parties who can make a difference and who can be inspired by the history. So stay tuned. That is another chapter that is yet to be written.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. So I want to thank everyone for coming today. We always save our chat questions, so we will check out those questions. If we think we have an answer for something, we'll reach out to you and answer your question. Thanks to Chelsea for writing this book. There would not be a conservative climate movement without y'all. If you are in the DC area, I want to make a shout out. Chelsea and Bob are going to be in person tomorrow at 7 o'clock talking about this book. If you're in the DC area and you want to attend, hit one of us up. We'll get you the details on where that's going to be. And folks, just once again, thanks for being here, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks. Congratulations, Chelsea, on publication.
Thank
you.
Thanks, Chelsea.